In this episode, we start by clearing up a problem that confuses almost every new learner at first. The CDPSE exam is not testing whether you can recite laws or memorize definitions in isolation, and it is not testing whether you are already an experienced privacy leader. Instead, it tests whether you can think like someone who turns privacy requirements into working, defensible decisions inside real systems and real organizations. That means you are learning a way of reasoning, where you can look at a situation, identify what privacy problem exists, decide what obligations apply, choose controls that make sense, and explain how you would prove those controls are actually working. The exam spans 4 domains, and each domain represents a different part of that privacy engineering mindset, from governance and operational accountability to risk management, to building privacy into products and data flows, and finally to working with technology and security practices that support privacy outcomes. By the end of this lesson, you should feel oriented, not overwhelmed, because you will be able to place every study topic into a simple map of what the exam is trying to measure in you. A good way to understand what is being tested is to imagine the exam as a series of decision moments rather than a series of trivia questions. You will be asked to recognize what kind of information is involved, what kind of processing is happening, who is impacted, and what the organization has promised or is required to do. Then you will be asked to choose actions that a privacy engineer would take, like documenting decisions, selecting controls, responding to incidents, or handling requests from individuals. Those actions are not random, because each one must connect back to privacy principles, risk thinking, and practical constraints like vendors, cross-border data movement, and system design. When you study, you should constantly practice translating from a situation into a requirement, and then from a requirement into a control, and then from a control into evidence. This is why the exam sits at an engineering crossroads, because you are expected to speak both the language of privacy obligations and the language of system reality. If you train yourself to follow that chain of reasoning, you will notice that the exam starts to feel coherent instead of wide and scattered. Domain 1 is where the exam checks whether you understand how privacy work is organized, owned, and kept accountable over time. Beginners often think governance is just meetings and policies, but the exam treats governance as the operating system for privacy decisions, because without roles, documentation, and repeatable processes, even good controls fall apart. You are expected to know how an organization identifies personal information, sets privacy principles, interprets laws into internal requirements, and keeps records that withstand change, audits, and incidents. You are also expected to know how privacy responsibilities are assigned across teams, because privacy engineering is rarely a solo activity. Another key theme is operational handling of vendors, incidents, and requests from individuals, because those are where privacy gets tested in reality. If you can explain who does what, why it matters, and how you would show that the organization is actually doing it, you are thinking in the way Domain 1 wants. Domain 2 shifts from organizing privacy work to managing privacy risk in a disciplined way. Many learners try to memorize risk terms without understanding the flow, but the exam is really asking whether you can run a repeatable process that finds privacy risks, evaluates them, and chooses responses that make sense. This includes understanding what assessments are for, how to scope them, what outputs matter, and how those outputs connect to decisions about controls and design choices. It also includes training and awareness, not as generic compliance behavior, but as a control that changes how people make decisions and handle data. Domain 2 also asks whether you can identify threats and vulnerabilities that create privacy exposure, because privacy failures often happen when systems behave in unexpected ways or when data moves to places no one tracked. Another major piece is frameworks, evidence, and metrics, because privacy programs need structure and proof, not just intent. When you see a question about risk, you should think about process consistency, decision logic, and how the organization demonstrates that the process is real and repeatable. Domain 3 is where the exam becomes much more about the data itself and how it moves through systems, products, and organizational activities. If Domain 1 tells you who is responsible and Domain 2 tells you how to evaluate risk, Domain 3 asks whether you can trace data, classify it, and set practical limits on how it can be used. For new learners, the biggest mental shift is realizing that privacy engineering is largely about understanding data flows, not just data storage. You must be able to think about where data comes from, why it was collected, how it is transformed, who can access it, where it is sent, and what happens when it is reused for new purposes like analytics. You will also see attention to data quality and accuracy, because poor data quality can create privacy harm, such as making wrong decisions about people or failing to honor their preferences and rights. Domain 3 expects you to connect privacy principles to data handling practices, such as limiting use to what is appropriate, keeping inventories current, and ensuring classification is meaningful rather than decorative. If you can reason about data like a living asset that changes over time, you will be aligned with what Domain 3 tests. Domain 4 brings the technical and security side into focus, but it does so through a privacy lens rather than a pure cybersecurity lens. Beginners sometimes think this domain is about learning tools or deep configuration details, but the exam is aiming higher and more practical than that. It tests whether you can choose and evaluate technical controls that support privacy, such as access controls, logging approaches, retention and deletion controls, encryption concepts, and system design practices that reduce exposure. It also tests whether you understand how privacy requirements get implemented in systems that have constraints, such as legacy platforms, shared services, and vendor-managed infrastructure. The privacy engineer role here is not to become the main security operator, but to ensure privacy outcomes are achieved through technical measures and measurable behavior. That includes thinking about the confidentiality of personal information, the integrity of records, and the availability of systems that support rights handling and incident response. In this domain, expect questions that ask you to pick designs and controls that reduce privacy risk while still enabling the organization to operate. When you step back and connect all 4 domains, a pattern appears that can guide how you study and how you answer questions. Domain 1 establishes foundations. What counts as personal information, what principles apply, what the organization's obligations are, and how accountability and operations are run. Domain 2 creates the decision engine, how risk is identified, assessed, responded to, monitored, and proven through evidence. Domain 3 makes it concrete in data handling, knowing what data exists, how it flows, how it is classified, and how use is limited to respect purpose and fairness. Domain 4 translates those requirements into technology and control behavior that can be validated and maintained. A strong exam answer typically connects at least 2 of these domains, even if the question seems to sit in only one. For example, a question about a vendor is not only governance, because it connects to risk assessment, evidence, and technical controls, all while involving real data flows. Learning to see these connections is one of the most reliable ways to raise your score. A key concept the exam tests is the difference between a privacy principle and a privacy control, because learners often blend them together. A principle is a guiding rule, like transparency, purpose limitation, data minimization, or accountability, and it helps you decide what should be true about a system and a process. A control is something the organization does to make the principle real, like a documented review step, a role assignment, an access restriction, a retention rule, or a monitoring metric. You will be expected to recognize which is which, and to choose controls that actually support the principle rather than just sounding good. For example, if transparency is required, a control might include consistent notice content tied to data use and changes, plus a process to update it when processing changes. If purpose limitation is required, a control might include defined allowed uses and review gates when a team wants to add a new use like a new analytics pipeline. Thinking in this way helps you avoid answers that are too vague, because vague answers sound like promises, while controls sound like actions and proof. Another repeated exam theme is evidence, because privacy work that cannot be demonstrated is privacy work that cannot be defended. Evidence is not only an audit artifact, and it is not only a document stored somewhere, because the exam treats evidence as the visible trail that shows controls are operating. Evidence can be policy and procedure records, but it can also be records of assessments, training completion, approvals, access reviews, incident timelines, request handling logs, and system-generated logs that show the control happened. Beginners sometimes fear evidence questions because they think it becomes paperwork-heavy, but you can simplify it by asking a single question. If someone challenged this program, what would you show to prove you did what you said you do? This is also why the exam cares about documentation that survives organizational change, because privacy programs outlive individual employees and must remain consistent. As you study, practice turning every control into the evidence you would use to prove it, because that habit is exactly aligned with how the exam measures competence. The exam also tests how you handle ambiguity and trade-offs, because real privacy engineering rarely provides perfect conditions. You may face incomplete data inventories, competing business timelines, pressure from partners, or systems that were built long before privacy expectations evolved. The exam will often give you an imperfect scenario and ask what you should do next, and the best answers usually involve a repeatable process rather than a dramatic one-time fix. That might mean scoping an assessment, documenting assumptions, selecting a risk response, assigning responsibilities, and then putting monitoring in place to confirm the response works. You should be cautious of answers that sound like you can solve everything instantly, because they ignore operational reality and usually fail the governance and risk logic the exam emphasizes. At the same time, you should be cautious of answers that only say to write a policy, because policies without control behavior and evidence do not close risk. The exam rewards balanced thinking that respects privacy outcomes and organizational constraints. A very common misconception among new learners is that privacy engineering is the same thing as security, just with different vocabulary. There is overlap, and many privacy controls depend on security controls, but the exam is careful to test privacy-specific outcomes like lawful and fair processing, honoring individual rights, limiting use, and ensuring transparency and accountability. Security might focus on preventing unauthorized access, but privacy asks why access exists at all and whether the use is appropriate to the purpose and consent expectations. Security might focus on keeping systems available, but privacy might focus on whether availability supports rights fulfillment and incident response. Security might focus on encryption and logging, but privacy asks whether those controls are configured and governed in ways that support privacy obligations, like retention limits and restricted access to logs that contain personal information. When you see a technical control in a question, look for the privacy reason it is being used, because that framing is usually where the correct answer lives. This distinction helps you avoid answers that are technically strong but privacy weak. Because the exam is domain-based, you can also predict what a question is truly asking by listening for certain signals in the wording. If the focus is on roles, documentation, vendor contracts, incident triggers, or handling requests from individuals, your mental model should immediately lean toward governance and operations. If the focus is on assessing, evaluating likelihood and impact, choosing responses, monitoring, or metrics, you should lean toward risk management and program controls. If the focus is on inventory, data flow, classification, accuracy, or data use, you should lean toward data lifecycle and processing logic. If the focus is on technical controls, architecture, system behavior, access, retention, and protection measures, you should lean toward technology and privacy-supporting security practices. The best answers often include one step that stabilizes the process, one step that reduces risk, and one step that produces evidence. This approach keeps you grounded when a question feels complex, because you are choosing a privacy engineering move, not guessing vocabulary. The date note in the title matters because it reminds you that exam blueprints and focus areas can evolve, and strong test takers align their study habits with what is currently tested. You do not need to fear version changes, but you should build your understanding around the domain objectives and their intent rather than around random facts. When objectives are updated, the deeper skills remain the same. Identify personal information accurately, apply principles consistently, interpret obligations into requirements, manage risk as a process, map and control data flows, and select technical controls that support privacy outcomes. In other words, the exam is testing durable reasoning skills more than fragile memorization. This is also why your best study strategy is to practice explanation, because if you can explain why a control exists and how it supports a principle, you can usually handle slight changes in terminology. Your goal is to become fluent in the logic that connects privacy goals to system reality, because that logic travels across versions. To make this practical for your study, Think of every domain as building one layer of a complete privacy engineering story. First, the organization defines what it is responsible for and who owns the work, and it captures that through principles, roles, and documentation. Next, the organization runs a consistent risk process to decide what matters most and what responses are appropriate, and it tracks progress through monitoring and metrics. Then, the organization applies that logic to the actual data, keeping inventories and flows visible, keeping classification meaningful, maintaining quality, and limiting use to appropriate purposes. Finally, the organization supports the whole system with technical measures that protect data and demonstrate control behavior. If you use that story as your mental map, the exam becomes less like a pile of topics and more like a single connected discipline. That connected discipline is what the CDPSE credential represents, and it is what the exam is trying to measure in you. As we wrap up, remember that the CDPSE exam is essentially asking whether you can translate privacy expectations into operational reality and defend your decisions with repeatable processes and proof. Domain 1 checks your ability to build accountability and operational handling for privacy. Domain 2 checks your ability to manage privacy risk with structure and evidence. Domain 3 checks your ability to understand and control data through its lifecycle. And Domain 4 checks your ability to connect privacy outcomes to technology and security-aligned controls. If you study with the habit of moving from principle to requirement to control to evidence, you will be training the exact muscles the exam wants. When a question feels intimidating, bring it back to that chain and ask what the organization must do, how it would do it, and how it would show it. That way, even as topics vary, your thinking remains stable and exam-ready, which is the most reliable path to success for a brand new learner.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.